I want to welcome everybody to the 5th annual Community Forum on Public Housing. Now, I've looked around the room. Now, if we could do this real quick, it will only take approximately 5 minutes. All we want to know is your name and what community that you are representing. Name and what community. I've sort of figured out if we do that, that would be about 10 seconds each person, and that should only take a few minutes so that we will all know who each other is. Okay, we'll start with you. Oh, I guess you should start with me since I'm up here, huh? Yeah. I am T. Turner. I am with Hope in the Cities, and I represent all of Richmond's communities.
My name's Silver Persinger. I live in Oregon Hill, and I'm just an interested citizen.
My name is Mo Carnage. I live at the Wingnut Anarchist Collective in Barton Heights.
James Shelton. I live in Chesterfield, and I'm a member of Richmond Transit Riders Union.
I'm Sarah Oaks. I'm here representing myself, but I'm from Churchill.
Brenda Kenny. I represent the Whipping Court community.
I'm Amanda Long. I'm a member of RePHRAME, and I live in Fulton.
I'm Diane Lillie. I live in the West End.
I'm Deborah Willis, and I on Richmond Redevelopment, the Advisory Task Force, and I represent Randolph and Maitland.
Stan Naiman, Chesterfield, RePHRAME.
Small houses.
Small house.
Small house, used house.
Hi, I'm Charlene Harris. I'm with RePHRAME, and I'm with the small scattered housing.
I'm Brenda Hunt. I'm Thunder White, and I'm with Maynard area.
Say, oh, Jody White.
I'm Phil Cunningham. I'm with Students for Social Action at VCU, and I live in Randolph.
I'm here.
And you are?
I'm Lillian Carter from West End.
Okay.
My name is Roy Bryan. I'm with the local NWC.
Okay.
I'm Huey Tran. I live in Carver Community, and I'm here with Southern's Underground.
I'm Elizabeth Albrecht. I live in Northside, and I'm with Southern's Underground.
My name is Salem Acuña. I am a supporter of RePHRAME, organizer with SONG, Southerners Underground, and I live in Oregon.
Pat Levy, Lavelle Legal Aid Justice Center, First District, Richmond.
Hi, I'm Allison Conyers, and I work with the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities.
I'm Diana Damshan with Hope in the Cities. I'm from Romania, just visiting the States.
Charlotte Freeman, also with Hope in the Cities. Part-time in Churchill, part-time in DC.
Good afternoon. My name is Vera Smith. I'm a resident of Richmond. I was displaced by the city of Richmond, when I grew up, and I'm just a concerned citizen and I want to be informed.
My name is Kelly Brown. I'm with Daughters of Zelophehad.
Andrew Terry from Richmond Hill, here in Churchill.
Andrew Schoeneman from VCU, School of Social Work, and a supporter member of RePHRAME.
Patrice Jeffrey. I live in Orion, and I'm volunteering tonight.
Hi, I'm Catherine Beal. I live in Carver.
How could there no representative RePHRAME let me get the court?
Kathy Woodson with Virginia Organizing. We're partner with RePHRAME.
Daryl Toller from Redcliffe County, a member of VCU Center on Human Need and the Engaging Richmond Initiative.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Abaman. I'm here representing Congressman Bobby Scott from 3rd District. I actually live in Shaka Bottom. Just want to let you know that Congressman Scott is very vocal about poverty. He's very interested in the topic.
See, I saved the two best for last. Now, which one y'all the best? You or him? You get the yeah, she gave it up. You gave it again. What's your name? Where you from? Speak up.
Ethan Todd.
These are my two biological interns.
Okay, and I didn't introduce our presenters. They will introduce themselves when they come up. I just wanted you to know that what we could do in a short time if we decide to do it together. I also wanted you to see that this community forum is well represented. It's well represented from, by individuals from every community in Richmond, pretty much, as well as several counties. And in order for us to meet the objective of this organization, we really do need to understand the importance of all of us coming together to work for a common cause. What we are gathered here this evening to do is to help us better serve a community that we're all supporting through our presence. We're going to do that through a series of exercises. And before we move into those exercises, we're going to invite Lillie Estes to come up, but she told me I need to pray first. Since we're in a church, it's quite appropriate to pray. Just a little crazy, so whether I'm in a church or not, I always think it's appropriate to pray. But after the invocation, we're going to invite Lillie Estes to share with us the agenda summary. But let us pray first. Father, we thank you for this day and for this time. We thank you for this gathering. We thank you, Lord God, for your presence with us. And I ask you to settle our hearts, our minds, and our spirits, that we might be strengthened, focused, and encouraged to do the things that you called us to do. I ask a special blessing for some of the RePHRAME members that would have liked to have been here this evening but could not, particularly Sister Cora, who have gone through surgery today. We ask you to bless her recovery, encourage her spirit, and restore her to full health and strength so that she can continue to run the race that you have set before her. And it's in your name that we pray and give you all the praises. And let the people of God say together, Amen. Amen.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Lillie. I really want to thank you all for pressing your way through to come and be with us this evening to really do this very important function, which is really retooling what we've done for many years and try to get more effective voices from poverty communities, disaffected communities, whatever metaphor you want to use. But we want to show that there is power in numbers, in collective numbers, and the diversity that we really bring to the table. So tonight, as T was saying, that we have a good cross-section of the community, meaning the metro community represented here, and we really want to build upon that by digging deep into what our voices added to different drivers that's happening in the community, the Anti-Poverty Commission, the Unpacking the 2010 Census, the GRTC Task Force. There are certain things that are really impacting the metro area, and we need to get this information in different institutions and different neighborhoods consistently. So our agenda tonight is really set up of some historical information that will be presented by our facilitators. And then we want to add your input. We have some resource information back here, which is being voter ready, being educated about health care information. The workforce investment pipeline created a special brochure for us tonight so that we could pass along to the public housing community so that they know that they were willing and ready to be job-ready advocates for our public housing neighbors. And then we have a movement workshop that will be conducted at the VCU Theater tomorrow or the next day one, and someone will give you some more information about that. Feel free to really dig deep and think about, you know, what it feels like to live in public housing, to live near public housing, to not live near public housing, and to hear stuff, and to really make it germane to what you hear and try to draw the correlations and the authentic truths in order to help us engage and, you know, do a new thing to some old issues. And again, thank you all for coming out.
And next we're going to have, and there's...
Some of y'all didn't get to sign in, so I'm going to pass this around, and we want you to put your city council district, your congressional district on these sheets, and we want to know if you ride the bus or if you have a housing choice voucher, because we're collecting data in order to really mine this information and be able to turn it into something productive and hold our elected officials accountable, hold ourselves accountable for retooling how we live in our communities.
And there's a minor adjustment on the in the program. Instead of having small breakout group discussions, we're going to have a large group discussion as it will be led and defined by our facilitators for the Unpacking the Census, Qasarah Bey and Jonathan Zur.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. We are really excited to be here and to be able to have some conversation with you, to share some information, and really to learn in a spirit of community and in conversation. I'm Jonathan with the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities.
Qasarah Bey with Embrace Richmond.
And we have been part of a process and a program called Unpacking the 2010 Census for quite a while now. And I want to tell you a little bit about how this came about and what it has meant for our region. Then we'll be able to talk a little bit about some of the data. But I think the story of Unpacking the Census can be very helpful for us. About a year and a half ago, a group at Hope in the Cities got together and heard Dr. John Moeser make a presentation. And Dr. Moeser is a retired professor from VCU. He's now a senior fellow at the University of Richmond. And after seeing this presentation, a few folks got together to think about how do we spread this information, how do we spread this knowledge across our region? How do we take one person's knowledge and make sure that as many people as possible can hear this important data and this important information? Our hope was to be able to train maybe 15 to 20 people to be able to go out and lead maybe 20 or 25 presentations or dialogues, have some conversation in the community. Fast forward a few months, last January we got together, we had a weekend where people were invited to come to learn how to be facilitators. You heard me saying we were hoping for 15 to 20 people. We had over 40 people come to learn how to be facilitators for this program. And then we put a call out to the community and said, would you like to hear this information and learn about it and be part of a dialogue about poverty in our region, what the challenges are, what the opportunities are for us moving forward? We hope to get 20 or 25. Since February of this year, we have had over 75 presentations and dialogues, similar to what we'll be having tonight. We've had the Goochland Free Clinic. We've had hospitals. We've had schools. We're here with RePHRAME. We've had the Chamber of Commerce. So we've had businesses, we've had religious groups, we've had all kinds of groups coming together to hear this information. And while that's been happening, the mayor has had an anti-poverty commission and is trying to do work to address poverty at the policy level. So we have community involvement, over 1,000 people have seen this presentation, and we have political involvement, and our hope is that together, the shared wisdom in this room and in rooms like it, through that, we'll be able to create some positive change in our region. So we want to hear from you tonight. We want to know your perspectives, we want to know your experiences, we want to know your feelings, so that together we're able to create some positive change moving forward in our region.
What we're basically going to do is set the stage, particularly during this election and previous political conversations. We've heard poverty discussed. We've heard it talked about in various forms. We've heard it identified with various peoples and in various ways. But what we want to be able to do tonight is to give you an idea of poverty in Richmond according to the census. So what we're going to do, after we talk about how we will carry out our discussion as far as norms or ways of being as a group, we're going to show you some statistical data and then show you how we got to that point today. So, Jonathan?
Sure. So what we want to ask you to do is spend a little bit of time thinking about, it's supposed to be a circle, thinking about times when you've been part of conversations that have been productive, that have been positive, that have been good, when you've left and thought that was a good use of my time. Maybe I learned something, maybe I was challenged, maybe I grew, I felt like I was heard. And think about how people act in those positive group experiences. How do people treat one another? How do people act? And what I'll ask is if you can share out some of those behaviors, norms, values, and I'll put those into this circle, and then we'll put some of the behaviors, norms, values, how do people act on the outside if there are things that we don't want to see. So what are some of the ways that you think characterize a good group experience? How do people treat one another? What are some of the things that exist there?
Not interrupting.
So not interrupting, so listening would be a positive. A focus, sense of focus. So hand it here.
Being honest, about their true feelings.
Honesty and truth. Yes.
Being authentic.
You can just yell them out. You don't have to raise your hand. But
Having a diversity of opinion, I think helps too.
Diversity of opinion. And I might add to that, not just honesty. Not just the presence of diversity, but also people, diverse perspectives, or people feeling comfortable to speak up.
No, that's what I mean.
Everyone speaking.
So, full participation.
Free of judgment.
Judgment free.
Okay, we doing the ones on the outside too. Rude.
Sure. Okay, rude.
Rude.
Slash through that.
Use I statements.
I statements, what do you mean by I statements?
Don't speak for yourself, not other people.
Are there good or not so, thank you for helping us to move into the outside. Are there good or not so good behaviors? Things we want to see or things we want to avoid tonight and in our conversation? I'm sorry? Compassion with others.
Participation.
Participation. That's right.
A negative would be like talking points, like preconceived notions or something.
So I come in and I'm not actually listening to what the other person says, I'm just saying, repeating what I've heard over and over and over.
Being careful of making promises.
Okay, on the inside, careful about promises, or?
That could go either way. I guess, in the inside.
Okay, on the inside being careful and on the outside breaking promises, or
Yeah, breaking
misleading?
promises.
Okay, unrealistic promises? Again, you can just call some out.
That's like on the outside, I'll call it soapboxing, preaching, sermons.
So there's a place for preaching, and there's a place maybe.
How about respect?
Respect? Certainly.
Having divergent goals is bad, or can be bad, if
Okay.
you both don't want the same thing. Or
So different goals or different purpose.
How about loving each other?
Loving each other? Sure. What were you going to say?
Win-win solutions, like both sides get what they want.
Win-win solutions? we can continue to add. I will say that most groups have a much easier time coming up with the outside than the inside. So I give you a lot of credit for focusing on those positives in terms of conversation. Again, we can continue to add to these, but what we're hoping to do tonight, obviously, is try to model, live up to these behaviors that we've written on the inside, try to avoid these behaviors on the outside, and we can continue to come back to this if we need to check one another, challenge one another, but also if we want to add some things that will help us to have a more productive and rich conversation. So as we said, we're talking about the Unpacking the 2010 Census program. It's a project that's jointly sponsored by Hope in the Cities and the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. And Dr. John Moeser is the professor who's done the research for what we're going to see. We're going to show you a few slides to start with some information, and then we're going to go into a DVD which has a longer presentation by Dr. Moeser about some of the history, some of the context for what we're here to talk about tonight.
So as you can see on this first slide, it gives you a general overview of the poverty rates in Richmond from 1970 to 2010. What I would draw your attention to is how between 1970 and 1990, poverty rates were pretty static. 18%, 19.3, just kind of fluctuated about a percent. Between 1990 and 2000, you have a full percent, I'm sorry, there was a full percent drop down to 18.2, and then between 2000 and 2010, you have a sharp increase in 7% poverty rates in Richmond.
So we can think about who's living in poverty with this information. Certainly we've had some growth. We can talk about why and how many of us in the room may have experienced some of that. But we want to focus on a little bit also who is living in poverty. And one of the things we know if we look at the region, the Richmond region, so not just the city, but also including the counties around the City of Richmond, that we see different racial groups. So 48% of all people living below the poverty line are black or African American, based on the 2009 American Community Survey and 2010 Census. So 48%. What that means is more than half of the people living below the poverty line in Richmond are not black. How that happens is because what we see is in the city, poverty is very concentrated. So it's very focused in certain neighborhoods and certain communities. Outside of the city, it's much more spread out. It's much more spread out. So it's not as visible, even though some of those challenges exist. 40% of people living in poverty in Metro Richmond are white. And then you can see 9% for Hispanic and 3% for Asian. With that, we want to think about where folks are living in poverty.
Now you heard Jonathan just talk about in the city there's concentration. And this slide shows you that. It shows you the Metro Richmond area. You've got Charles City here, Henrico, Chesterfield, New Kent. The bright red that you see is greater than 20% poverty rate. This is Richmond. The poverty rate, the red area, is more than half of Richmond. You have a little bit of red here in Goochland. Can anybody guess why?
Everybody moving in the city.
Well, you raised a good point. I'll say something about that in a minute. But Goochland, here is a correctional center. Yeah, right here in Goochland. But he said everybody's moving in the city, so if you have this concentration of poverty in the city and everybody's theoretically moving in the city that has its needs, why might they be moving in the city? What's going on in the city?
More services.
More services. What else can you think about?
Buses.
Buses, public services.
Jobs, you said?
Most of all your jobs is in the city, especially in the state.
It's easier to be poor in urban areas.
It's easier to be poor in urban areas. I hear some responses to that. Sidewalks.
There's some disagreement there?
Well, from the comments that we've heard and the suggestions that we've heard, more services in the city. This gentleman said sidewalks. Can you help
Well,
me?
for instance, I mean, where would you, like, say you were homeless in Chesterfield, where would you go? Everything is someone's private property. There's very little public spaces to get around on, you know, unless you're going to walk in, actually in the street. And you see people walking in the street, but And there's very little connected public spaces. If you're homeless in the city, you can go from Monroe Park, walk to the Daily Planet, you know. But in Chesterfield, you're pretty much stuck.
Can the folks in the back hear? I just thought he made a very good point about, you know, being able to even be homeless in Chesterfield means you're in somebody's private property. In the city, you're on a public sidewalk. So when we think about this concentration here, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, poverty in Richmond has a different face, a different texture, a different tone, because in the counties, it can be more dispersed, more hidden. And we'll move into some conversation about why it's so visible here in Richmond.
Sure.
This is one reason why.
So we can see a map here of several public housing communities in the city of Richmond. We have Gilpincourt, we have Wickham, Mosby, Fairfield, Creighton, all around there. And you can see where it is in terms of 95 and the interstate. You can see where it is in terms of being linked to certain areas. And what we want you to do is think about and remember this image, sort of take a mental picture of this image, because in the DVD we're going to show you in a moment, you're going to see a similar image, but an image that goes back to 1937. One of the things we have learned as we've worked on this presentation and as we've worked with Dr. Moeser is that these things didn't happen by accident. And we want to hear a little bit as we have some conversations after the DVD about how that connects to your experience, how you feel about that, what maybe is new information for you, and what really connects to your lived experience. So keeping this in mind, we're going to shift and show you about 20 minutes of a DVD with Dr. Moeser. I don't know if there's a way to get some lights off in here. That might be helpful. And then afterward, we'll have some conversation. Again, think about what stands out to you, what's new information, what connects to your lived experience, and what does it feel like to hear and be a part of experiencing this information. Thank you. I don't know who did that, but thank you.
How did all this get started? Well, we could have an extended history lesson going way back, but actually I think we need to focus on more recent history. And I think we could do no better than to start really in the late 1930s, during the New Deal, when we were experiencing the Great Depression. During that time, there was a new federal agency that was created known as the Home Owners Loan Corporation, HOLC. And by the way, it was created to stem the foreclosure crisis. What HOLC did was to use local bankers and local realtors in cities across the United States to go into all of the neighborhoods of these cities and rate them, evaluate them, as a way to assess their suitability for funding. And the criteria they used for evaluating neighborhoods included terrain, whether it was a hilly terrain or whether it was relatively flat, the income level of the residents, type of housing, the age of the housing, quality of the building, sales and rental demand in the neighborhood. The field workers were also asked to identify positive features, such as parks, schools, churches, utilities, whether there were zoning and other kinds of land use restrictions. But they were also to evaluate negative features, such as the absence of zoning or the absence of other restrictions, obnoxious odors that might come from slaughterhouses, cleaning plants. Any fire hazards would degrade the quality of the neighborhood. And a major factor that was carefully examined was whether neighborhoods were experiencing infiltrations, quote, of lower grade populations. And that meant specifically blacks, Jews, or immigrants. Now, in the case of the City of Richmond, the single most influential indicator in evaluating neighborhoods was race. And the evaluators actually did grade the neighborhoods. A were the best neighborhoods. Neighborhoods graded A, B, C, and D. They were colored. They were color-coded. The grade A neighborhoods were colored green. By the way, this is Windsor Farms. Windsor Farms was developed in the 1920s. So it was alive and well in 1937 when HOLC was evaluating neighborhoods. This is Windsor Farms. The blue neighborhoods were B. These were good, solid, upper middle income neighborhoods. Yellow were the grade C neighborhoods. These were often kind of working class, white working class neighborhoods. And grade D were colored red. And they were the lowest class neighborhoods. Every single black neighborhood in the City of Richmond, every one, was graded D and colored red. This is regardless of income or occupation. Jackson Ward was given a D grade, and yet Jackson Ward was thriving with successful businesses and banks and department stores. As a matter of fact, Jackson Ward was known as the Wall Street of Black America. But it was graded D, because that's where black people lived. Income wasn't even mentioned. Occupation was not even mentioned. Jackson Ward had lots of teachers and ministers and doctors and lawyers. Wasn't even mentioned. Working class white neighborhoods consistently got a higher grade than did any black neighborhood, including Jackson Ward. There were two neighborhoods that would have been graded B, but in fact received a C grade. One was Bird Park. And the reason that Bird Park was graded downward from B to C, and therefore colored yellow, is that, and this is during the days of school segregation, the white children living in Bird Park, their school, the school for whites, actually was located in the adjoining neighborhood of Randolph, which was a black neighborhood. So the very fact that they had to go to school in a black neighborhood was going to degrade the value of the neighborhood. And moreover, and this was noted in the evaluation form, that it was observed that blacks passed back and forth to Bird Park. That notation was made as well. The result, though, of this redlining is that over the years, black neighborhoods were starved for investment. Now, if you fast forward to the 1990s, we go from redlining to greenlining. Now, what in the world do I mean by greenlining? Well, under redlining, as I noted, loan officers used to reject loan applications in neighborhoods that had gotten a grade D. But in the 1990s, a new model of exploitation led lenders to give low-income people the false hope of owning their own home. So lenders aggressively marketed overpriced products with onerous terms in the very same neighborhoods where mainstream lenders once refused to lend. In neighborhoods in 37 that were graded A and B, from 2007 to 2009, there were 78 trustee sales. But in neighborhoods graded C and D in 1937, in the years between 2007 and 2009, there were 651. Huge disparity. In 1950, October the 25th, there was a news story in the Richmond News Leader. It was an afternoon paper. It was a daily. And it was announcing the appointment of the new director of the Richmond Redevelopment and Housing Authority. His name was Fred Fay. Detailed studies of city records will be made to determine areas of tax delinquency, lowest assessment and revenue production, areas where normal growth is impeded by slum conditions, and finally, those slum areas most attractive to private developers, end quote. So what we're getting ready to do now as we get underway the second half of the 20th century is what then was a planner's dream. And planners, professional planners, were deeply implicated in all of this, and that was wholesale urban renewal. Richmond wanted to become kind of a new South city. And so a lot of cities, to become really progressive cities, were able to get major highways located right through their jurisdiction. And Richmond, wanting to be a progressive New South city, felt that it was very important that we too have a major highway. So we come now to the building of the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, which is now, by the way, Interstate 95. This is another tragic story. The Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, by the way, was not popular in the city of Richmond. This is one of the few occasions when white citizens and black citizens, when there was an opportunity to vote in a referendum, joined forces. And they overwhelmingly defeated a referendum, basically querying citizens whether they wanted an expressway. And there was a resounding no. Well, the white power structure was taken aback by that, but they didn't want to take no for an answer. So a few years later, they had a second referendum. So at any rate, there was this second referendum, and the result was exactly the same as it was a few years previously. Well, again, the white oligarchy wasn't content with that second rejection, and so this time they went to the state legislature, and they lobbied the General Assembly of Virginia to create a special district known as the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike Authority. The bill was passed, signed by the governor. The authority was governed by appointees, and essentially these were all allied with the Richmond white business community. So number one, they decided they were going to build a highway, and secondly, the highway was going to go right through Jackson Ward. This is a photograph taken in the late 50s of the completed highway. 10% of the black population was displaced. Now, African Americans who lost their home to the highway, who were in a better position to buy a new home, often went to Barton Heights, the area around Virginia Union. But lower income blacks who really did not have the resources to buy another house, at that point were forced into public housing. And by that time, Fairfield and Whitcomb Court in the 50s had been built and placed in East End Richmond. So this is when you begin to see two things. Number one, you begin to see many blacks moving to East End Richmond, going to Fairfield and Whitcomb Court. Poverty begins to go up. And this is the beginning also of segregation within the black community itself. One thing about Jackson Ward, it was segregated from the rest of the city, but internally Jackson Ward was socially very integrated. All incomes within Jackson Ward lived close together. You had business executives and you had professionals who lived just down the block from tradespeople, and they lived just about a short distance from people who were really struggling. But it was a very cohesive, integrated socially neighborhood. The highway broke that up. One small victory that the black community won had to do with this structure right here. These are photographs of the demolition in preparation for the highway. This is a very historic church. This is 6 Mount Zion Baptist Church. This church was started at the end of the Civil War by a slave who had been freed at the end of the war. He started this church in an abandoned Confederate horse stable along the James River. His name was John Jasper. He had learned to read and write remarkably. Well, the church grew and grew to the point that they had to move out of the horse stables, and they built a new church here. The black community rallied around that church and were able to save it. There was a decision to extend Interstate 64 west, and the decision was for it to extend through the city and connect with the turnpike. So when 64 was extended and connected with the turnpike, more homes were destroyed. In fact, there was a very, very cohesive black neighborhood known as Navy Hill. And that's really the first instance when you begin to see a large chunk of Navy Hill be destroyed. What ultimately led to the complete loss of Navy Hill, and by the way, Navy Hill School was a wonderful school. It was an elementary school for blacks. This is a photo of the choir. This is a photograph of a schoolroom. And the school was well known in the black community as being one of the best schools anywhere. In fact, I've read where the achievement level of that elementary school rivaled the achievement level of any white elementary school in the city of Richmond. So it really was quite a phenomenal school. But what happened, in addition to the extension of 64, is that we built the Coliseum, and then next came the Biotech Center. I took this photograph from the top of City Hall. This essentially was Navy Hill. It is no longer. There is not a single structure of Navy Hill that exists. It was tragic enough that Navy Hill was completely destroyed. But equally tragic is the lack of any material evidence of that neighborhood. There was a small granite marker that read, "Dedicated to the memories of our demised loved ones, July the 17th, 1993. Love and memories never die as days roll on and years pass by. Deep in our hearts, memories are kept of the ones we loved and shall never forget." Donated by the Bob Curry Society, the Navy Hill Reunion, and Friends. This marker, unfortunately, was misplaced, and I found it in the lower level of a parking deck owned by the Biotech Center. That is a pretty powerful statement about the significance or the lack thereof of Navy Hill to the history of this city and how we memorialize our history. That is until recently, in September, when a new permanent state marker, as you can see in this photograph, was erected. You can see in the photo a brief history recorded there on the sign, and then the granite marker is actually at the base of that sign. Then we come to Fulton. Fulton was destroyed. This is a photograph of Fulton in the 1890s. It was a city within a city. It was a magnificent place. Even in the late 60s, Fulton had 3,000 residents, 836 buildings, that included churches, restaurants, stores, schools, even a movie theater. This is Fulton today. What happened was that Fulton was this product of urban renewal. There was to be an industrial park put in Fulton to create jobs. Now, that would have been a good thing if jobs had been created. The problem was it never became an industrial park, and it remained vacant for years and years and years. There's now some housing in Fulton, but it looks like suburban housing. You still have some of the old streets of Fulton that are visible.
As you kind of process the video, move into groups of 4 or 5. And I'm going to ask that we have group 1 here, and 4 or 5 folks, hopefully that you didn't come with and you don't know, except for your interns. I expect your interns to be with you to support you. But if we can ask you to move in groups of 4 or 5, like I said, preferably folks you don't know or don't know well. Having group 1, 2, 3 at the back table, just for discussion purposes. 4, 5, 6 along the table, 7, and 8. Can you move into those groups now, and then I'll tell you what you'll be talking about. 2 minutes. Let's go. Let's see which group goes first. We have our groups. This group 1, 2. Is that group 3 there? Right there. 4, 5, 6. Okay. Here we go. And what I'd like you to do is to either self-select or select a group scribe, someone to write. Because what I'd like you to do is to share in your groups what stood out to you from the statistical information or from the DVD. What stood out to you? How did you feel about what you heard? Did anything surprise you? Did anything make you say, wow, I heard a couple of wows, I'll say. And what those things were. And lastly, does your personal history coincide with this history? Yes. I saw some nodding in the room. I think some people were familiar with some parts of the history. Some people maybe not so much, or maybe you know folks. So let's talk about that in our groups. And I'm asking for a scribe to kind of jot down key points or highlight, things you want to be highlighted, because we'll have a sharing of the groups when you're done. We're going to give you about 15 minutes to discuss as a group. So it's currently 7 o'clock, 7:15, and then we'll report out.
Okay.